In this town of Hawthorne, I am the law. Sergeant Hawkins hissed through clenched teeth, his brutal hand pressing Alicia's face into the scorching hot sand of the training ground. He smirked, tearing the insignia from her uniform, relishing the absolute power as he trampled a small, dark-skinned female rookie. Around them, his subordinate officers guffawed, seeing this as an amusing initiation ritual, believing their uniforms granted them license to do anything without consequence. But Hawkins had made the most foolish mistake of his life. The girl lying motionless beneath him was no trembling lamb. Alicia Raines was a ghost, a CIA phantom assassin, a killing machine from SOG who had once decimated an entire insurgency in the Middle East. Her silence wasn't fear, but the grim calculation of death itself. In a single breath, the crisp snap of Hawkins's elbow bone echoed like a dry twig breaking, transforming the crowd's mocking laughter into absolute horror. Nearby, Kyle Mercer, an Iraq War veteran, went chalk white. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a haunting recognition as he identified the striking posture, a brutal killing technique he had seen ghost operatives employ in Fallujah. He knew Hawkins had just ripped open the facade of a nightmare. Alicia wasn't merely here for training. She was a death sentence, dispatched to burn down the corrupt and treasonous empire of Captain Donovan, a man who believed he could sell national secrets undetected. When justice is corrupted by those in power, is extreme violence the only answer to cleanse a rotten system? Or is this the opening shot for Project Rise, where forgotten heroes rise to reclaim a blood debt? If the legal system shields those who harm you, will you bow your head or rise as a ghost of vengeance? Leave a comment, and watch now to witness the price of arrogance. The morning in Hawthorne County always began with a kind of sunlight that made people feel as if the town deliberately pushed the heat of the entire year onto a single patch of sand. Hawthorne Field sat precariously on the edge of town, a place no one wanted to pass unless they had a reason. The sand rose in thin waves like smoke, and the metallic scent of rusted training frames mixed into the air, making the place feel more like an old factory than a police training center. From afar, shouts echoed with every stomp of boots on the ground, forming a soundscape the locals had grown used to for many years. It was the reminder that in this remote corner of the American South, strength was always displayed before anyone mentioned the law. Inside the central office, the air conditioner rattled as if it were ready to break at any moment. Lieutenant Carl Henson sat behind an old wooden desk, flipping through the list of recruits. He paused when he saw the name Alicia Raines, frowned, and read it again. A stranger among the newcomers, especially someone without local backing, always made him feel life was about to get more complicated than necessary. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and looked out the window, where the wind blew sand into thin streaks across the training yard. "Who's this girl?" he muttered. People nearby stayed silent, because everyone understood Henson only needed the smallest excuse to make things difficult for any rookie. Outside, the older trainees stood around the running area. Sweat dripped onto the hot sand, and each person wore the expression of someone used to speaking through aggression. They exchanged crude jokes about race, and about newcomers who had come and quit after a few weeks. One man raised his voice, saying, "This place wasn't for the weak." Two others burst into laughter, brittle and rough like sand scraping stone. The air, thick with arrogance and a false sense of superiority, coated the training ground, making the morning feel heavier than the heat pressing down on it. In that moment, Alicia stepped in. The sand shifted to the sides with each of her steps. Her small frame didn't make an impression on the trainees standing there, but her steady, quiet stride was something a keen observer would notice right away. She was an image out of place in the noisy crowd. Alicia didn't look around for long. She simply cast her eyes toward the training yard as if she already knew what awaited her. The bus from town left behind the smell of engine oil, and the moment she walked through the steel gate, her presence sparked murmurs among the group closest to her. A few meters away, Hawkins stood with his arms crossed, watching her. His face held a mix of curiosity and annoyance at the sight of a recruit, unlike those he was used to dealing with. He jerked his chin toward Tomley, dragging out his words as if to mock her. "A rookie, huh? Looks like the wind could blow her away." Tomley burst out laughing, the sound sharp and much louder than the moment called for. The two of them looked at Alicia the way one might look at an object brought in for them to test. For Hawkins, the more out of place a rookie seemed, the more he enjoyed proving who really ran things here. Alicia stepped into the line, her face showing nothing in particular. The whispers around her continued. Someone at the back of the line quietly asked if she came from the eastern side of town, where most residents were black. Another muttered that she looked too quiet, the type who easily became a target for teasing. Alicia heard every word, but her expression didn't shift. She stood straight, eyes forward, as if the heat swirling around her had no way of touching her. Lieutenant Henson stepped onto the yard, the sound of his boots hitting the ground making the entire line stiffen. Sunlight cut across his face, highlighting the deep wrinkles. He scanned the row of recruits and asked, "Where's Alicia Rains?" Alicia raised her hand and stepped forward. Henson looked her up and down, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "I hope you don't waste my time." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the yard. A brief silence settled over the training ground. Alicia answered in a calm voice, "No, sir." She sounded neither defiant nor afraid. More like she was stating a simple fact. The tone made Hawkins narrow his eyes. In his experience, a rookie who spoke like that usually fell into one of two categories: either too naive to understand anything, or too composed to be easily read. Both types tended to provoke his instinct to test them. Alicia returned to her position and felt the heat grow harsher. The smell of hot sand rising from the ground thickened the air. She wasn't unfamiliar with high-pressure environments. Hawthorne simply carried a heavier feeling, as if every pair of eyes were assessing which category she belonged to. Someone who could be bent easily, or someone tough enough to become an irritation. What she sensed most clearly was Hawkins's attention scraping at her like dull metal against stone, muted but sharp. At the far corner of the yard, Hawkins remained with his arms crossed. His crooked smirk appeared like a warning sign. He didn't look at Alicia as a future teammate, but as an object waiting to be tested for durability. That distorted interest made the heat of the yard feel even more suffocating, and Alicia knew the real trial would come sooner than she expected. Noon at Hawthorne Field was always as heavy as a pan lowered over someone's head. Sunlight poured onto the sand in thick sheets, making the ground tremble as if the heat itself were breathing. Rows of old containers, their paint peeling in patches, sat still like witnesses to generations of training. Everything in this place gave the impression that it wasn't waiting for anyone to adapt. It forced people to accept the rules set by whoever was strongest. Alicia stepped into her second day, but had already realized this town did not live by any handbook. The drills were merely an outer shell for an underground system that stubborn groups operated in their own way. The whistle blared sharply, followed by the heavy footfalls from the assembly area. Hawkins emerged from the corner of the yard, his gait dripping with challenge. Every step he slammed into the sand left a mark, as if declaring this was his territory. Broad shoulders, a face always tilted with a hint of smugness. The people around him reacted like territorial dogs just released from a chain. Tomley walked close beside him, looking excited like a child about to watch a show. Mercer followed a few steps behind, watching but not sharing the others' enthusiasm. Hawkins stood in the center of the yard, hands on his hips. His eyes swept across the line of recruits before he barked, "New blood, step out. Let me see how much you can take." His voice bounced off the emptiness of the training ground, creating a harsh metallic echo. Tomley laughed, short but sharp enough to add pressure on those still standing at attention. Mercer remained silent, his gaze toward Hawkins holding something more like caution than agreement. Alicia stepped forward when Hawkins turned his head toward her. His eyes stopped on her body, then drifted downward to the tightened muscles on her arms as she breathed. He smirked, as if questioning whether the person in front of him was even worth his attention. "You look this weak and still signed up for this place," Hawkins said. His tone was half contempt, half probing. In the oppressive air, that probing was more dangerous than an outright threat. She responded in an even voice. "Weak or not, you can see for yourself." There was no aggression, but no submission either. Her words fell like a stone into still water, drawing several glances her way. Hawkins tilted his head, studying her for a few more seconds, his expression loosening slightly, as if her answer truly caught his interest. Behind them, Tomley whistled, then called out loudly, "Hawkins, careful, this one might run faster than your ex-wife." A wave of laughter broke out, soaked in mockery. Under the scorching sun, ridicule spread like a contagious disease. Alicia stood still, her expression unchanged. She did not react to the laughter, because she knew that was what they were waiting for. Lieutenant Henson watched from afar, arms crossed. He did not stop this display of intimidation because he saw it as an inseparable part of the selection process. In Hawthorne, only those who could survive this type of clash stayed long enough. Alicia quietly took note of how much Henson permitted. It was a small detail, but crucial to her real objective. When the physical drills began, Alicia felt the faction lines more clearly. The loudest men immediately pressed toward the weaker recruits. Those who spoke less kept their distance, but their glances showed that even if they weren't participating, they would not intervene. This was no longer training. This was a test of who bowed to whom. Alicia understood that this structure had existed long enough to become culture, and anyone who disrupted the rhythm would be pushed outside its boundaries. Hawkins dictated the pace of the drills, shouting each command. The temperature kept rising, making every breath feel heavier. Alicia ran the assigned laps around the training yard. Sand sprayed upward with each step, leaving a trail of dust behind her. She kept her stride steady, her breathing controlled, her steps light but firm. Other recruits began to lose stamina after only a few minutes, some quitting halfway. Alicia stayed at the same pace. In the final lap, she pulled ahead of a group of older trainees, making several of them glance at one another. When she crossed the finish line earlier than expected, the entire training ground froze for a moment. Hawkins looked at her, and his gaze changed noticeably. His attention sharpened suddenly, as if he had just discovered a challenge he had not asked for. Alicia wiped her sweat, her eyes steady and unflinching. Her breathing wasn't heavy, quietly unsettling those nearest to her. No compliment was spoken, no applause. Everyone simply watched Hawkins. Tomley raised his eyebrows, giving Hawkins a small tug on the arm as if asking what he planned to do next. Mercer's eyes narrowed into a contemplative sliver. Hawkins said nothing at first. He just stared at Alicia, as though calculating a new test only he knew the answer to. The training yard seemed to grow hotter, even though the sun was already shifting west. Silence stretched for several seconds before Hawkins turned to Tomley, lowered his head, and spoke quietly enough for no one else to hear. But Alicia still felt it. Hawkins leaned in toward Tomley, the corner of his mouth lifting as he said, "We see how far that girl can go." And Tomley nodded immediately, as if it were an idea he had been waiting for all along. The third morning at Hawthorne Field opened with a blinding white light that made everything look as though it were placed beneath a layer of heated glass. Alicia walked across the yard when the wind was only strong enough to flip a few strands of dried grass. She was used to the atmosphere being pressed down by a quiet kind of hostility. After 2 days, She had realized that the aggression here did not erupt into violence immediately. It operated in gradual layers, like an invisible hand testing who would break first. The indifferent eyes watching from afar added to that pressure. They did not want trouble. And even more, they did not want to become the next target, so they chose to stare at the ground or turn their gaze elsewhere. Near the water station, Alicia lifted a full container into her hands and headed toward the physical training area. Tomley walked in the opposite direction, his mouth curling upward when he saw her. He did not step aside but moved closer, then suddenly twisted his foot into a patch of hardened soil. The container tilted violently. Alicia lost her balance, and she fell onto the sand. Tomley glanced down at her with a satisfied smirk. "Oh, sorry, rookie," he said, without a shred of sincerity. Hawkins stood a few paces behind, arms crossed, eyes full of the delight of someone who had just watched a rehearsal of a scene he enjoyed. Not far away, Jenna was wiping sweat from her forehead. She saw Alicia being knocked down, but her gaze shifted away instantly. She turned her back faster than necessary, as if afraid Alicia might notice the choice she had just made. Jenna understood that the cruelty in Hawthorne Field did not come only from people like Hawkins, but also from those who stood aside and convinced themselves that silence was the safest answer. Alicia sat up and brushed sand from her palms. Tomley lingered, waiting for her reaction, the way a person waits for prey to thrash. But Alicia said in an even voice, "I can handle it." The words caused the air around them to dip for a few seconds. Hawkins did not like the way she responded, but he kept his cheerful expression. Mercer watched from the far end of the yard, his gaze holding on the scene for a long moment. He was not a weak man, but battlefield memories had made him sensitive to group intimidation. Seeing Alicia rise without resistance, he sensed an unusual resilience in her, something that made it seem as though she did not consider Tomley's action reason enough to lose her composure. By noon, Hawthorne Field grew so hot that the air distorted the shapes of things in the distance. Hawkins called Alicia over, pointing at a sandbag twice the size of what everyone else carried. "You take this and run one lap," he said, smirking. "Consider it your personal test, rookie." His tone made it obvious this test was not in any official training curriculum. Tomley laughed approvingly, while Mercer frowned. The heavy sandbag dropped onto Alicia's shoulders, bending her back slightly. A few trainees nearby watched with amusement. Others looked uneasy on her behalf, yet none stepped in. No one would confront Hawkins. Alicia took her first steps, the ground beneath her seeming softer under the weight. She had no reason to prove she was stronger than anyone, but she did have a larger purpose that required her to stay calm. Heat rose from the sand in a pale shimmer, like a wavering backdrop. Alicia kept running, each breath controlled even as her shoulders reddened. Whispers rose behind her whenever she cleared a slope or rounded a rugged corner. Some hoped she would stop, so they would have an excuse to mock her again. But she continued, observing, noting where people stood, whose eyes tracked her, how Hawkins issued commands. These were the things she needed to understand the fragile power structure of Hawthorne Field. Mercer stood beside another trainee and murmured, "That sandbag's overloaded." The other man glanced at Alicia and replied, "Don't get involved. Here, sticking your neck out for her is like signing up to get jumped." Mercer nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the woman running with the oversized sandbag in the stifling heat. In that moment, he saw in her endurance something unlike people merely forced into obedience. It resembled what he had once witnessed in far harsher places than Hawthorne places, where surviving meant pushing beyond one's limits. When Alicia completed the lap, she set the sandbag down. Deep red marks lined her shoulders, but her breathing had not broken rhythm. The people around her stayed silent for a few seconds. Henson, standing at a distance, even glanced her way. Mercer swallowed a feeling he could not quite name. He was not only impressed that she finished, he was struck by the way she did it, like someone who had endured far more brutal tests before. Hawkins watched with an expression caught between irritation and intrigue. He had not expected Alicia to get through such a demanding task. He also did not want to see her resilience, because it meant his games would have to escalate if he wanted to see her fall. Alicia recognized that look, and she knew this was only the beginning of a chain of trials Hawkins was quietly constructing. By the end of the day, Alicia returned to the locker area. The hallway was silent, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly as though about to die. When she opened her locker, she found a folded piece of paper placed right in the middle of her belongings. On top was a sentence scrawled in marker. "Rookie. Stays quiet. To stay safe." It wasn't a threat. No red ink. No symbols meant to frighten. But the shaky handwriting and the way the note was tucked precisely among her personal items made Alicia feel the message clearly. It was a warning. The endurance test fell exactly at the time when the heat at Hawthorne Field reached a level that seemed capable of melting the ground itself. Sunlight poured onto the training yard in a harsh sheet of brightness, making each grain of sand shimmer like shattered glass. The air thickened into a dense mass, pressing every breath down to the base of the throat. Since early morning, groups of trainees had lined up, each wearing an expression mixed with fatigue and combativeness. Alicia looked around and sensed the uneasy anticipation hanging over the entire field. She knew Hawkins would not miss the chance to push this test heavier than any day before. The first station was the high rope climb. A long rope hung between two old metal pillars, its base frayed but still squealing whenever someone pulled hard on it. Alicia gripped the rope and began to climb. Sand stuck to her palms, making the rope's surface slicker. When she reached halfway up, the rope jerked violently. Tomley stood below, withdrawing his hand from an unmistakably intentional pull. Alicia nearly slipped, her foot skidding off the rope for a brief moment. But her reflexes were so quick that a few witnesses shuddered. She hooked her elbow around the rope, regained her balance instantly, and kept climbing. Tomley looked up with a twisted grin. "Careful there, rookie," he said, his cigarette-tainted breath drifting upward like a taunt. Alicia did not look down, nor did she pause. She continued climbing at a steady rhythm. Her silence threw Tomley off for a second, before he turned toward Hawkins, as if expecting praise. Hawkins stood a short distance away, arms folded, watching Alicia's every movement. "If you fall, don't blame anyone," he said calmly, as though he were stating a law of nature rather than issuing a threat. The other recruits who heard him felt a chill run down their spines. At Hawthorne Field, Hawkins's words carried weight, heavier than metal. Alicia reached the top and stood on the crossbar. From above, the training yard sprawled out like a chaotic stretch of terrain. Obstacle stations were scattered everywhere. The sand churned into deep grooves, and dozens of eyes pointed upward at her. Every gaze seemed to carry the same hope that she would break her rhythm and fall, so they'd have something to laugh at. Alicia drew in a quiet breath and descended. The afternoon arrived with an even denser heat. That was when the obstacle course began. Low wooden boards, deep sand pits, and crooked fences formed a long, winding path. Alicia ran with the group, not drawing attention, but each station she completed was tidier than anyone expected. Observers began to notice how she shrugged her shoulders slightly to reduce impact when diving under a fence, how she sidestepped soft sand pockets, or how she rotated her wrist before touching a barrier. These were ordinary motions to the untrained eye, but anyone perceptive would know they didn't happen by chance. Mercer stood near Hawkins while watching. He tracked Alicia's progress with a quiet but sharp gaze. He asked under his breath, "What do you think she is?" Hawkins shrugged, a half-smile spreading. "Something for me to grind down." "What else?" The answer left Mercer silent for a moment, as though weighing something. Hawkins clearly wasn't thinking deeply. He saw Alicia as a game whose difficulty he could adjust however he pleased. Alicia heard that exchange as she ran past, but it left her mind immediately. She kept her breathing steady, and eyes on the next station. At Hawthorne, every threat was swallowed by sand before it ever reached her. Her regulated breaths made a few people glance over. They couldn't understand how she maintained her rhythm for so long in the suffocating heat. Hawkins prepared the final station, according to his own design. It was a run through a sand pit, deeper than usual. This sand didn't just sink, it shifted shape with the wind. Anyone entering it would lose momentum on the very first step. When Alicia's turn came, she stepped into the pit and felt the resistance of the ground instantly. It seemed intent on swallowing her feet, but Alicia didn't speed up. She kept her same pace. She knew forcing a jump would only sink her deeper. Hawkins watched, his fist tightening when he realized Alicia wasn't struggling the way he wanted. She didn't run faster than others, but her endurance unsettled him, especially because she didn't complain and finished the hardest station with composure. By the end of the day, the sun angled low, but the heat still clung to the skin like a thin film of dust. Alicia sat down to remove her shoes, letting sand pour out in small streams. Her toes were reddened from friction. Mercer stood a few steps away, pretending to check his laces while actually observing her. He expected to find exhaustion, shaking, or any sign of someone who had been under pressure too long. But what appeared in her eyes was something he had not anticipated. A perfect stillness. It wasn't indifference. Nor was it the inward retreat of someone afraid. It resembled the surface of a deep lake, where every disturbance is swallowed before it can form a ripple. A chill crept up Mercer's spine. He had met people with eyes like that in Iraq, and they were always the kind of people the battlefield itself avoided. The morning at Hawthorne Field opened with the sound of tires screeching across sand. Huge tires lay in long rows, like a crude battlefield. The wind carried heat straight into people's faces, mixed with the sharp, pungent smell of rubber. The trainees had gathered in a half-circle, all eyes fixed on Hawkins. He stood at the center of the training yard like the conductor of a performance whose script only he knew. The second week had passed under his invisible control, and today he intended to push Alicia's limits one step further. Alicia approached the row of tires just in time to hear Hawkins bark an order. "Rains, take the biggest one." "Yes, that one. Think of it as extra practice." His voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade gliding across metal. The tire he pointed at was the type used for the heavier male trainees. Its size alone made it clear it was not part of any official exercise for newcomers. A few people whistled, and others laughed. Mercer stood beside the line of containers, his expression tightening, though he said nothing. Tomley raised his phone, sweeping the screen as if capturing the most entertaining moment of the day. "Look at that! The rookie's turning red already!" he shouted, his voice meant to rile up the crowd. Laughter erupted at once. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was cold, like stones thrown against the back of someone already straining under a burden. The scorching sun amplified the cruelty, filling the yard with a suffocating sense of mockery. Alicia placed her hands on the rope, tied around the tire. She bent down, exhaling hot air onto the sand. No one could hear her thoughts, but her movements followed a clear rhythm. She gripped the rope, tightened her hold, then stepped forward. The tire shuddered heavy as a slab of stone. Each step she took carved deep lines into the sand. But Alicia did not stop. She moved slowly, very slowly, yet with such steadiness that the early laughter began to fade. From the line behind, Jenna watched for a moment before turning away. She bit her lip at the sight of Alicia straining, but she averted her eyes as if the scene had nothing to do with her. It wasn't compassion that made her look away. She simply understood the rule of this yard. Anyone showing even a hint of humanity became the next target. Jenna, like many here, chose her own safety over confronting what was right. As Alicia dragged the tire past Mercer, he lowered his head and asked quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "You're not tired?" A sincere question, tinged with worry. Alicia took another step before answering, her gaze still fixed ahead. "I'm used to it." Those words did not come out forcefully or with emphasis, yet they sent a chill through Mercer. No one was used to this kind of treatment. No one endured this level of ridicule with such calm unless they had stood in far worse places or faced tests far harsher than today's bullying. Whispers spread. Some trainees began to look uneasy. The tire was large enough that most newcomers needed 2 people to pull it. Yet Alicia kept her pace alone. Veins rose along her arms, her shoulders reddened under the sun, but her steps did not falter. Hawkins watched, his lips curling slightly not in satisfaction, but in irritation. It was the smile of a man losing patience, because his prey refused to collapse as expected. Laughter rose again around the training yard, this time quicker, as if the crowd wanted to force the mockery to reach its peak. Hawkins laughed too, though his was crooked, as if he were tightening an invisible rope to justify escalating his behavior. Tomley filmed continuously, occasionally shouting taunts to spark more attention. The air thickened, as if everyone were waiting for Alicia to fall, just so they could affirm they had been right about her. Alicia finished dragging the tire, moved to the next area, and stood upright to steady her breath. Sweat ran down her back, the sand sticking in streaks like scratches on her skin. She did not look at Hawkins, but she knew he was watching every small movement she made. She did not seek attention, but Hawkins forced everything to orbit around her, as though determined to break the silence she carried each day. Hawkins stepped closer, his boots grinding lightly against the sand. "Rookie," he said, his voice low and harsh like a plow scraping the earth. "If you want to survive here, you need to know your place." The crowd fell silent at once. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear across the entire yard. All eyes turned toward Alicia, waiting to see her reaction. Alicia looked at Hawkins, her gaze unwavering. That silence, her refusal to flinch, sent a numb wave of anger across his face. Hawkins was accustomed to defiance, to fear, to the panic that usually flickered in the eyes of those he cornered. But the woman standing before him was like a stone in a fire pit. Her calm made him feel as if he, not she, were the one being tested. Mercer watched, tension tightening his features. He saw Hawkins's hand curl into a fist before relaxing again, the gesture of a man struggling to hold himself back from breaking something. Mercer recognized the sign. He had seen it in soldiers losing control on the battlefield, in men convincing themselves that violence was necessary to assert dominance. And Hawkins was standing dangerously close to that line. One that, if crossed, would take everything far beyond the rules of the training yard. Hawkins stood still for a few seconds, then stepped closer to Alicia, his breath brushing against her face. Mercer froze when he saw Hawkins's eyes shift an unmistakable change, the look of someone who had just decided on something far outside the bounds of mere harassment. A dark intuition rose in Mercer's chest, and he knew whatever happened next would no longer be a joke. Afternoons at Hawthorne Field always carried the leftover heat of the entire day, trapping a sweltering layer of warmth on the sand like smoldering embers. The sunlight had begun to soften, yet the heat still rose from the ground, making the yard feel like a brick kiln refusing to cool. After days of watching and simmering with irritation, Hawkins decided to give Alicia a personal lesson, one not found in any training manual. In the sparsely occupied yard, Hawkins trudged behind a row of faded containers, signaling for Tomley and Mercer to follow. Sand crackled under his boots, each step forming a faint fracture in the air. An air already waiting for something worse than usual. When the three stood hidden behind the container, Hawkins folded his arms, His voice came out low and thick, as if scraped through a throat heated for too long. The rookie needs to learn her place. The words weren't loud, but they carried days' worth of restrained irritation. An irritation not born from anything Alicia did, but from the way she existed without bowing the way he expected. Tomley let out a laugh, the sound echoing against the rough metal behind them. "About time, huh? Thought you wanted to keep that cat-and-mouse thing going a few more days." Despite laughing, he still watched Hawkins's reaction carefully. This time, Hawkins's face showed no amusement. He turned to Tomley with a fixed stare, reminding him that whatever happened next was no longer a game. "We drag her out to the back sandlot," Hawkins said, his voice light but sharp as a blade. "No one walks through there at this hour. We'll just say it's extra conditioning." The way he said it made something serious sound routine, like someone suggesting grabbing a beer after work. That normalization was what made Mercer's gut twist. Mercer leaned against the metal wall, hands in his pockets. Hot wind funneled through the narrow gap between the containers, creating a tight, suffocating draft. "Hawkins, go too far. And it won't end well," he said not loudly, but clearly enough for both men to hear. He remembered previous times Hawkins crossed the line with other rookies, and something about Alicia made him hesitate. Something in her eyes. Hawkins turned toward him. A smile appeared, cold and thin like sheet metal scorched for years under the sun. "What ends well or not, I decide." He didn't raise his voice, but the defiance showed in his stance, in the way his eyes narrowed, seeking nothing but obedience. Tomley jumped in immediately, his tone full of excitement. "What? You scared of the girl? She's just a rookie." "Christ, you're getting soft, Mercer." He jerked his chin toward him, trying to jab the nerve that would make Mercer back down. Mercer stayed silent, eyes lowered to the sand. He wasn't afraid of Alicia. He was afraid of where Hawkins was heading. But in a place like Hawthorne Field, objecting out loud meant turning yourself into prey for men who had too much pent-up energy and too few boundaries. Hawkins spat onto the ground, the sound of liquid hitting dry sand sharp in the stretching silence. "She looks at me funny," he said, voice dropping further, "like she's not scared, and I don't like that." His tone held a kind of agitation, built up over days, the agitation of a man accustomed to power, unsettled by meeting a surface that refused to react the way he wanted. Tomley rubbed his hands together, face bright with anticipation. "Heads up, I'm recording some of it. For fun." His voice was no different from a child bragging about a new toy. Hawkins flicked his hand dismissively. "Record it, but let me handle her." The words made Tomley laugh again. But there was no amusement in Hawkins's eyes, only calculation and a simmering anger Mercer sensed clearly. Meanwhile, Alicia was tidying her equipment in the old storage shed. Sunlight struck the metal roof, making it crackle like coals splashed with water. She folded a towel, tied her bag, and sat to adjust her shoelaces. A small, ordinary action. Yet it left her unintentionally vulnerable at the worst possible time. Alicia didn't know 3 men were heading toward her, but she could sense a shift in the air of the training yard. The wind brought with it the faint smell of cigarette smoke, lingering from where Tomley had stood earlier. A strange scent within the familiar heat. Alicia stood, rolled her wrist, and squinted toward the far end of the yard out of habit. But the area behind the containers seemed quieter than usual, too quiet, holding something unresolved. Hawkins walked ahead, his shoulders leaning forward with the posture of a man who had already made up his mind. Mercer followed, eyes lowered, reluctance tightening the corner of his gaze. Tomley came last, phone in hand, its screen reflecting the orange glow of the late sun. Sand shifted under their steps, forming thin fractures across the ground. When they rounded the corner of the container, Hawkins suddenly stopped. From that angle, he saw Alicia bending down to tie her shoe. A small act, but to him, it was the perfect signal. A smile spread across his face, a smile hot enough to raise the temperature of the air, already too hot to bear anything more. Hawkins watched Alicia from afar, certainty in his gaze. Then he looked at Tomley and Mercer. He gave a small nod, like a man choosing the ideal moment. And in that instant, the faint stirring of sand beneath their feet felt like an omen that the afternoon was about to turn in a direction Alicia would not expect. But one Hawkins had long been waiting for. The sand lot behind the old row of containers was drenched in the orange light of late afternoon light that subtly warped everything, as if the heat itself were squeezing the space. This area was usually empty at this hour. No one came here to train or talk. Wind scraped across the metal sheets, producing dry, rattling sounds that made the place feel cut off from the rest of Hawthorne Field. Alicia walked toward the spot Hawkins indicated, her chest tightening for just a moment, though her face remained perfectly calm. She could smell the lingering trace of cigarette smoke, the kind that announced the presence of men with bad intentions. "This area's for a private test today," Hawkins said when Alicia stopped a few steps away. His voice was hoarse and thick, as if the entire day's heat had lodged itself in his throat. Alicia detected something off in his breathing. It didn't follow the rhythm of someone preparing for a drill. It carried the impatience of a man looking for a reason to act. Tomley stood behind Hawkins, hands on his hips, grinning with exposed teeth, all excitement. Mercer had stepped back toward the metal wall, his shoulders tense with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Hawkins, don't," he murmured. The words fell into the space like a weak rope thrown into a desert. Hawkins didn't let him finish. He flicked his hand dismissively, as if swatting away the existence of all caution. "Shut up!" Alicia looked at Hawkins without blinking. Her arms hung loosely at her sides. Her body settled into the neutral stance she had practiced for years, one that prevented her from telegraphing anything to hostile observers. "What kind of test?" she asked. And that was the last question she asked with any trace of cooperation. Hawkins stepped closer, his boots carving lines through the hot sand. The distance between them closed quickly, too quickly, violating any standard of training protocol. "A test to see if you know how to submit," he said, his voice low and warped, as if it had already slipped beyond the boundary of a police officer. Alicia stood exactly where she was. "I'm here to train, not." The sentence cut off abruptly. Hawkins seized her wrist with a force that came without warning. His twist wrenched her arm sideways, sand spraying up into her face. The sting of the grains hitting her skin told her he was no longer in control of his mind. Tomley burst into loud laughter. "Holy hell! You're doing it for real!" His voice clanged in the air like metal striking an empty barrel, but Hawkins didn't laugh. He clenched his teeth, his face flushed, whether from anger or exhilaration. His hand clamped onto Alicia's collar and yanked hard. The tearing fabric sounded sharp enough for Mercer to freeze. The shirt ripped diagonally, exposing Alicia's shoulder beneath the fading sunlight. Alicia stayed still for a beat. Not from fear, not from shame. Her heartbeat changed course, thudding deeper instead of faster. The skin at the nape of her neck heated as if touched by a steel pin. Dormant reflexes stirred awake. This was not anger. This was survival. Hawkins didn't notice the change. He only saw that Alicia wasn't struggling like the others he'd broken before. That made him even more determined to crush her composure. He shoved her shoulder, forcing her down into the sand. The scorched ground pressed against her back, collapsing her sense of time into a single line. His breath hit her ear thick with cigarettes and the humid heat of a man crossing all boundaries. "Here, you learn who controls who," he said. Hot sand clung to her skin, her knee striking the ground hard. Tomley stood nearby filming, laughing breathlessly. Mercer stood farther back, and what he saw now tightened his throat. He knew Hawkins was aggressive, but he had never seen him cross this far. From where he stood, Mercer saw Alicia's back muscles tense in a very different way. Not like someone bracing for pain, but like someone preparing for a precise movement. In Alicia's mind, the voice of Ghost, her old instructor, slipped in, cold and sharp. Do not react until your life is in danger. She had survived harsher trials in places without witnesses. She had been strapped to chairs, plunged into cold water, and deprived of breath in battlefield simulations. Each time, she held herself together. But now, Hawkins's hand bore down on her shoulder, dragging her body into a position with no retreat. The heat of the sand and the breath of the man above her merged into one signal. The line had been crossed. Alicia's breathing slowed to nearly nothing. Every nerve in her body tightened with the sound of metal scraping metal. An old mechanism awakened. Ghost began rising from the place she had buried it for so long. Not for vengeance, not for dominance, for survival. Hawkins didn't see it. Harding walked past behind them, recording with obvious delight. Mercer watched, his chest constricting. He saw Alicia's body shift barely, subtly, like a slice of wind cutting through the heat. But for someone who had lived through real battlefields, Mercer recognized the movement instantly. It meant only one thing. She was about to counter. The wind shifted at the exact moment the sun dipped behind the storage buildings, sweeping a swirl of heat across the deserted sand lot. The temperature was still blistering, but for a brief instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. Hawkins remained pressed against Alicia, his breath spilling across her neck, thick with cigarettes and something disturbingly close to excitement. Sand stuck to her shoulder, burning like tiny needles, and somewhere within the movement of her body, the final strand of restraint snapped free from its latch. In her mind, the sounds weren't the shouts of the men around her. They were metallic, cold, the sounds of ghost training, the sounds of missions she was never permitted to recall. And when her mind slipped into that place, her body moved long before her thoughts could name the action. Hawkins didn't understand what was happening. 1 second, he believed he held absolute control. Next, his wrist twisted in a direction no joint was designed to follow. Alicia shifted not with force, but with precision so exact that Hawkins's body folded like a door torn off its hinge. A sharp click broke the air, crisp as a fuse snapping. Hawkins screamed. The sound wasn't long or loud. It strangled halfway up his throat, as though the pain locked itself inside him. He tried to curse, to call her name, but Alicia rotated again, using his own momentum to flip him backward. The throw made no useless noise. It was clean, quiet, as silent as a blade drawn from a sheath in the dark. Tomley stood directly behind Hawkins, too close not to be caught in the whirl Alicia created. Instinctively, he lunged, phone still in hand. He meant to grab her shoulder, or at least touch her, before she regained balance. But to Alicia, Tomley's movement was slower than sand falling through fingers. She turned her hips, gliding past him like a thin shadow. As Tomley stumbled, Alicia struck the junction between his thigh and hip. The blow wasn't strong, but it was placed with such precision that his legs collapsed instantly. Tomley dropped to the sand, mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Before he could let out a strangled sound, Alicia touched a point on his wrist and twisted gently. Tomley hit the ground, motionless. No loud groan, no harsh impact. Only the faint whir of sand swirling around her as she shifted position. Mercer froze. He had seen movements like these before. Not at the base, not in police formations, but in Iraq. On moonless nights, when a few shadows slipped into the tents of terrorist commanders and left without a sound except the terror of those who survived. They moved like desert breath, silent, efficient. But Mercer knew they existed. Soldiers whispered about them, the ones who never appear in reports. He never thought he'd witness those movements again. Certainly not at Hawthorne Field. And never from the woman everyone called a rookie. Alicia, he shouted, not to stop her, but to stop the memories charging toward him like a pack of hounds. He feared the next second would move beyond any hope of control. Alicia stood in the sand, her breathing steady. No trembling. No gasps. Her eyes passed over Hawken, clutching his arm, face contorted, then over Tomley, twitching weakly. But Alicia's expression held no rage, no satisfaction, no sign of someone who had fought back. Only a deep, absolute emptiness, as if she had stepped out of a well inside her mind, where emotion could not survive. Mercer stepped backward. His footprint sank into the sand, a reflexive reaction to getting away from invisible danger. "What? What are you?" he asked, voice unsteady, as though afraid to name the answer forming in his mind. These weren't moves taught in standard training. Not by the police, not by the military. They belonged to a particular group, a group rumored about through whispers and unidentified bodies, a group created not to exist on paper. Alicia looked at him. Her gaze wasn't sharp or hostile. It was calm, flat, like a sheet of still water. But within that calm was a small flicker, something like a warning light. Mercer understood. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder to handle what he'd just seen with extreme care. She turned away. The wind tugged at the torn fabric on her left shoulder, revealing a small mark of ink no larger than a coin. Black, precise, carved with impossible detail. Mercer narrowed his eyes. He stepped forward, unable to trust what he saw. The mark wasn't decorative. It was a symbol, an insignia. End quote. And it looked exactly like the one he'd glimpsed on the arms of men during the Iraq operations. Men who appeared and vanished without leaving anything behind but fear. People rumored to belong to a classified program, a unit the government officially denied knowing. Specialists used for missions that would never be entered into any file. A strand of wind swept across them, carrying a metallic scent from the ink beneath her skin. Mercer stood rooted, his heart skipping as the tattoo came fully into view under the fading light. He stepped back with the most primal instinct a human could have. Instinct confronted with a truth beyond ordinary comprehension. Because he knew, in that exact moment, Alicia Rains was no longer a rookie. She was the thing the Iraq battlefield had learned to avoid. And now, that thing was standing in the middle of Hawthorne Field. Night fell over Hawthorne County like an old blanket pulled across a town that was rarely peaceful. Wind scraped against metal awnings with sparse, uneven rattles, and the tired yellow streetlights spilled blotches of dim illumination onto the pavement. People here were used to turmoil inside the police department, but they never imagined what happened on the training field that afternoon would find its way online. Yet right as the clock passed 9 in the evening, a 13-second video suddenly appeared in a local Facebook group, accompanied by a hastily written caption. Something happened at Hawthorne Field. Someone explained this. In the clip, the footage was shaky, but clear enough to show Hawkins lunging at Alicia. His hand gripping her wrist, as if to slam her into the ground, but the next moment made the entire town freeze. Alicia pivoted, and in a blink, Hawkins flipped backward like a sandbag. He hit the ground in a posture stripped of all weight. Wind hissing across the microphone made the video feel uncanny. No screams, no shouting, only precise, silent motion, so silent it seemed to violate logic. Comments flooded in beneath the clip. Someone asked, startled, "Who is that girl?" Another replied, "Look at Hawkins like someone kicked his legs out." Then more accounts jumped in. "That's not slipping. Her move looked like special forces." The words popped up, scrolled away, then returned like a swirling current. Within 10 minutes, the clip had been shared among 3 other small groups in town. Then onto the personal pages of a few residents known for exaggerating every Hawthorne incident. In the police department office, Donovan watched the clip on his computer screen. The blue glow sharpened his already cold face until it looked like a razor's edge. Henson stood behind him, unsure what to say. Donovan muted the audio and replayed the clip in slow motion. His eyes narrowed not at Hawkins falling, but at Alicia's pivot. That move could not have come from an ordinary trainee. "Take it down," Donovan said, his voice dropping like a hammer on the desk. Henson blinked, ready to ask something, but Donovan was no longer looking at him. "I don't want to see it again." "Understood?" Henson nodded, swallowing hard. "Then, what about her?" Donovan leaned back in his chair, his icy stare drifting past the foggy glass of the office. "Rookie's fault. Violation of procedure. That's enough." In a town like Hawthorne, those words were a sentence. If someone had to be blamed, it would never be Donovan's men. And Hawkins, humiliated or not, was still someone Donovan relied on. Out in the town, Hawthorne County immediately split into factions. Those who had been yelled at by Hawkins or pulled over without reason were delighted. "Good for him," one comment said. But others claimed Alicia had gone too far. A middle-aged woman typed, "A rookie hitting a superior? Absolutely not." Then someone chimed in, "The way she spun? That's not normal. Maybe she's military?" But regardless of sides, everyone agreed on one thing. Haven't seen something this interesting in a long time. In Hawthorne, authoritarian boredom was a daily meal. This clip was a sudden slap that woke the town from its habit of silence. In a small rented room near the industrial district, Alicia sat on her bed watching the clip. Just 13 seconds, but enough for her to know things had escaped the training yard. The image was blurry, but not enough to hide her technique. What caught her attention wasn't Hawkins or Tomley in the frame, it was the tilted angle. Tomley had turned on his camera before anything happened, which meant the leak wasn't intentional sabotage. It was stupidity. Alicia swiped to the end of the video and paused. At the 12th second, Hawkins's face wasn't visible, but a faint scrap of sound made her realize he had shouted something. No one could make out the words, but someone like Donovan didn't need clarity. This alone gave him everything he needed to inflate the narrative however he wanted. She exhaled quietly. Donovan would not let this spread. Alicia understood men like him well, treating the police department as personal property, treating the media as trash to be swept aside, and treating any recruit outside his circle as a nuisance. And just as she expected, near 10 o'clock that night, Donovan issued an internal memo. Trainee Alicia Rains conduct endangering fellow officers during training. His signature stretched long, curved like a blade, cutting into paper. Henson received the memo first. He stood in the empty hallway of the department, reading it 3 times before sighing. He knew Hawkins was wrong. He knew Alicia had been cornered, but he also knew Donovan would crush anyone who challenged him. Hawthorne Field did not let neutral men stand for long. Outside, the townspeople kept arguing about the clip. Some crowded into Clayton's bar, replaying it over and over for the whole table. Others sent it through texts saying, "Did you see that spin? Straight out of a movie." Some even claimed Alicia was a mercenary. Whether true or not, it no longer mattered. The town had found something new to obsess over. And while that fever spread faster than wildfire in dry brush, something else happened quietly. Before Donovan's memo finished circulating, an anonymous email left Hawthorne County. It went to the FBI field office in Atlanta, with no elaborate subject line, only one sentence: "Check Hawthorne. There is more here than you think." Attached was the 13-second clip, a pebble tossed into the still lake of federal attention, and the first ripple had already begun to spread. Night at the Hawthorne County Police Department sank into an unfamiliar stillness, broken only by the blue glow of a laptop screen reflecting across Donovan's face. He sat motionless, staring at a list of encrypted transactions scrolling past. the strings of characters writhing like countless worms burrowing beneath the rotted soil of his life. The 13-second clip of Alicia wasn't enough to keep him awake, but the attention coming from outside the town tightened his chest, as if an invisible hand were squeezing each breath. Donovan opened a file locked behind 3 layers of security. Inside was the agreement he had signed with Owen Price's security firm. 6 lines of content, so short it was almost brazen, yet holding enough weight to destroy an entire career if exposed. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, trying to convince himself everything remained under control, though his heart beat out of rhythm. He remembered the first time Price spoke of strategic consulting, that cold smile of his like a blade grazing skin. The money had been overwhelming, and the power Price promised made Donovan willing to erase every boundary. But back then, he never imagined the FBI would turn its attention toward Hawthorne because of a seemingly harmless clip. His phone lit up with a new email. Price wrote that he needed additional documents before their upcoming meeting, ending with a line that froze Donovan's blood. "My people are ready to transfer the funds." The words were light as a breeze, but carried the weight of a hammer suspended above the head of a traitor. Donovan deleted the email, though the tremor in his finger did not fade. He stood, crossing the small, cramped office, a space that always felt like someone might be watching from the shadows. From the window, streetlight glare illuminated the patchwork of notes covering his wall, where Price's name appeared more times than anyone else in the department. "Not now," he muttered, each word scraping through his throat like heavy stones. He pulled up Alicia's file and stared at her photo again. Her calm expression irritated him. That calmness did not belong to someone afraid of being dismissed from a training program. Donovan tapped his finger against the screen, each tap an echo of a countdown. "If she hadn't come here, everything would be fine," he said, though he knew it was an empty lie. A nameless message popped up without warning. "We sense you're being watched. Clean up while you can." Donovan froze, eyes widening. He knew messages like this were never jokes. If Price smelled danger, he would cut off the rotten flesh before the stench spread, and that rotten flesh was Donovan. The air in the room thickened, as if the floor itself were slowly pulling him down. He turned, scanning the space, a prickling sensation crawling along the back of his neck, as though someone were staring through the thin walls. He switched the light on to chase away the darkness, but the brightness only exposed how disturbingly empty the room was. Donovan grabbed his coat, shut down the laptop, and locked the drawer containing the most damning agreements. He didn't know whether leaving the room would buy him a few more days or bring him closer to elimination, but standing still was certainly the worst choice. He pushed the door open and stepped into the dim corridor, where the cold air brushed his face like a sign of an approaching shift. The moment he locked his office door, a chill swept across his neck, making him shudder. He turned toward the glass window just in time to see a faint reflection flicker and disappear. No footsteps, no breath, yet the sense of someone standing beside him clung to him like a shadow. In that instant, he understood Alicia was no longer the primary problem. Someone with the power to end him had begun paying attention. Donovan stood in the dark hallway, heart pounding out of rhythm, and realized the network he believed was protecting him might be the first one to target him. And if that happened, Hawthorne County was nowhere near large enough for him to hide. That morning, the air inside the Hawthorne Police Department felt heavy, like a low fog draped over the old medals hanging across the walls. When Lucas Ward stepped through the front doors, several officers paused mid-task, their eyes flashing with instinctive caution. Ward carried the steady calm of someone used to walking into places peaceful on the surface, but hollow beneath. He swept his eyes across the wide lobby, then murmured, half as a remark and half as a tease, "A lot of history in here." His voice was soft, but enough to make the room tighten for a beat. Donovan appeared almost immediately, wearing a polished, rehearsed smile as if practiced in front of a mirror. He stepped forward to shake Ward's hand, squeezing a little harder than normal. "We always cooperate with the feds," he said, his tone warm in a way that felt strained. Ward returned a faint smile, his eyes flicking briefly to Donovan's collar where a bead of sweat rolled downward, not the sweat of heat, but the sweat of pressure. Inside the office, Ward sat across from Donovan, opened a file, and skimmed the report of the incident at the training field. "Female trainee attacks, male instructor," he read aloud, pressing gently on each word. "Interesting." Donovan braced his elbows on the table, forcing down irritation as he replied, "Failure to follow orders. We're handling it internally." Ward lifted his gaze, the calm in his eyes so steady it unsettled Donovan. Ward placed the file on the desk and tapped the corner with the end of his pen, each tap marking a flaw in the story. "I watched the video. It tells a very different story from this report." Donovan looked down, brow tightening as he said, "That clip was edited. Unreliable." Ward didn't argue. He simply smiled, as if Donovan had just laid another brick in the wall of suspicion he was building around himself. Leaving Donovan's office, Ward met Henson in the hallway. He asked lightly, "How does the training field operate?" Henson responded curtly, shoulders stiffening, "Stable. What happened was minor." Ward nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was an acknowledgement of an artificial signal. He continued down the hall and requested access to the department's internal communications database. The file stated the reason as procedure review. But something sharper lay in his eyes. In the tech room, Ward stood beside the server monitor, arms loosely crossed. It took less than 10 minutes for him to find a strange encryption layer embedded in Donovan's account. No small-town officer in a place like Hawthorne had any reason to use this technique. Ward leaned against the table, tilting his head the way someone does when noticing grass growing the wrong way, a sign of something buried below. He switched off the screen and wrote a line in his notebook. "Irregularity. Dig deeper." Leaving the server room, Ward stopped by a second-floor window overlooking the training field. Below, Alicia walked past a stretch of wire fencing, sunlight laying a thin, burnished sheen across her face. He asked the officer beside him, "Who is she?" The man shrugged and answered vaguely, "Rains. Rookie. Quiet." Ward touched the tip of his pen to his chin, then smiled. "Good. Quiet people see more than loud ones." Meanwhile, Donovan watched Ward from the far end of the hallway. His eyes carried a mixture of worry and anger, as if weighing whether to interfere or observe. Ward noticed Donovan's reflection in the glass, but didn't turn around. He simply kept walking with a composure that, to Donovan, was more frightening than open suspicion. Ward exited the building toward his car, but slowed when the midday sun struck the vehicle, casting a crisp reflection of Donovan standing on the steps. Not the polite smile from earlier, his expression was darker now, rigid as stone. Like a man gauging a threat from the distance, someone afraid of the feds might choose. Ward opened the car door but paused long enough to adjust the rear-view mirror and look at Donovan again. The atmosphere in Hawthorne reminded Ward of many scenes he had encountered before. Places clean on the surface, but layered with buried garbage underneath, and with just a few shallow digs, the trash would surface. He told his assistant over the phone, "I want every internal communication file from this week. Don't let anyone in the department know." His voice was low, firm, as though he already sensed the rough outline of what lay beneath the ground. As his vehicle rolled away from the police department, Ward glanced in the mirror again. Donovan still stood there, staring straight at the car, unmoving. Ward exhaled softly, but with an edge the breath of someone stepping into a match where he already recognized the opponent. "This kind of calm," he murmured to himself, "is usually the calm before a strong wind." Abadas! On the road out of town, Ward lowered the window to breathe in Hawthorne's heat. But the scent that hit him didn't belong to a small town. It smelled like a place with something smoldering beneath the surface. He settled back in his seat, eyes fixed forward. "There's more here than a training field issue," he said, a sharp intuition rising through his chest. Meanwhile, inside the darkened office, Donovan shut the blinds and slumped into his chair. The meeting with Ward made him realize that every layer of camouflage he had built was beginning to crack. If the FBI dug deep enough, there was no guarantee he would keep his life, let alone his career. He lowered his head into his hands, breath jagged like a man trying to hold onto a rope already fraying. When Ward passed his car trunk to open it, he saw Donovan's reflection still frozen at the doorway, eyes fixed on him, as if calculating how to stop things from going any further. And Ward knew, from that moment on, the investigation was no longer an evaluation. For 3 months, Ward and his digital forensics team worked out of a temporary FBI satellite office on the outskirts of Hawthorne. The small room was constantly lit by monitor glow, and the sounds of rapid keyboard tapping echoed like the pulse of the investigation itself. They retrieved every file Donovan had deleted, every fragment of messaging, every financial transaction. As the data layers were restored, Ward leaned in and murmured, "Too clean." He had seen sloppy data wipes before, but a scrub pattern this deliberate appeared only in cases involving people who once worked near government systems. A young technician spun his chair around and said, "A normal person wouldn't know how to wipe at this level. This is a high-grade technique." Ward didn't answer. He just wrote a short line in his notebook. "Source. Federal connection?" Then he closed the notebook, the vague pressure in his chest expanding. He had worked corruption cases in many small towns, but he had never seen a town-level officer use such refined erasure methods. That raised a larger question. Who taught Donovan? Meanwhile, life in Hawthorne seemed unchanged. Residents still gathered outside the grocery store every morning, officers still patrolled like always, and the training field still echoed with shouts under the heat. But beneath that quiet surface were 3 months of covert investigation, during which Ward traced every minor bank account, inspected encrypted emails, and followed hidden transaction streams buried under multiple layers of rerouting. Every night, as local buildings went dark, Ward and his team remained at their desks, tugging at each thin strand in Donovan's network. Owen Price's name began appearing with increasing frequency in the data. Ward opened a photograph of Price. A European man with streaks of silver in his hair, smiling with the calm of someone who lived in a world where the law was just a thin border. Ward stared at the image for a long moment and whispered to himself, "A private security businessman in Eastern Europe, tied to a small-town American cop. Where's the link?" That question spawned new diagrams on the whiteboard, with Donovan sitting at the center like a spider in its web. One exhausted evening in a roadside motel, Ward spread the papers across the bed, marking each connection in red ink. A line from Donovan led to Price, and from Price branched a cluster of strange IP addresses located in an Eastern European nation. The network took shape, but that clarity only made him feel something was off, as though a critical piece was still missing. He circled Price's name, added a small symbol, then circled Donovan. A red line stretched between their names, pulsing like a warning heartbeat. Ward sent a preliminary report to the Department of Justice, outlining the irregularities in Donovan's accounts and the possibility of foreign money flowing into the police department. He expected a cautious reply, but DOJ responded with only 3 words: "Proceed. Stay silent." That answer made Ward stand still for a moment. DOJ silence wasn't apathy, it was a warning. They already knew the network was too big to shatter prematurely. At the same time, Ward began paying closer attention to Alicia. He realized she appeared almost nowhere in the department's internal videos, aside from the leaked clip. No training footage, no progress reports, no entry interviews. "File too clean," Ward wrote. No one is that clean. He submitted a request for Alicia's original records, and when the results returned, he froze. The data had been sealed by an agency outside the police system. The agency acronym had been erased, leaving behind a generic placeholder note that made Ward's skin crawl. In the days that followed, each time Ward visited the training field, he observed Alicia more closely. She moved lightly, spoke little, and avoided unnecessary contact. Not out of fear, but like someone maintaining their breathing in an environment that did not belong to them. Once, Ward stood on the second-floor balcony watching her walk past Hawkins without nodding or altering her pace. Hawkins, meanwhile, avoided her gaze like a guilty man glancing at his own coffin. Ward logged the observation in the mental drawer reserved for anomalous signs. While Ward tracked Donovan, the man himself grew increasingly frantic. The files he erased rose in number, and the speed of his actions accelerated. Ward read each deletion like reading the panicked breaths of a man unraveling. Donovan didn't know the FBI had already captured the server logs, meaning every move he made left residue. Ward's tech team restored each fragment like assembling shards of broken glass, forming a mirror reflecting Donovan's desperation. By the end of the second month, Ward uncovered an encrypted email chain between Donovan and Price, discussing the transport of a batch of documents Donovan referred to as the package. Ward stared at the string of characters, tension crawling from his neck down his spine. No town-level cop calls classified information a package, he said in the office, unless he knows exactly what he's smuggling. The tech team stopped typing, their eyes turning to Ward, sharing the weight of that intuition. During a rainy afternoon, Ward met Mercer in the parking lot. Mercer looked exhausted, his face more hollow than before. When Ward gently asked about the training field, Mercer only said, "There's something wrong here." He seemed ready to say more, but stopped when Donovan stepped through the rear door of the police department. They parted, each carrying different burdens. Ward sensed Mercer was holding something back, but it was time to press him. When night fell, Ward returned to the temporary office, opened his laptop, and reviewed the request for Alicia's records. The results remained covered with red seals from the unnamed agency. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, head tilted. A small-town cop and an ordinary trainee. No way they both connect to this network. Yet every clue kept pulling the two of them toward the same center. Ward switched off the lights and stepped outside. Hawthorne night was thick with moisture, streetlights shimmering like oil stains across water. As he unlocked his phone to review the next day's schedule, a message flashed on screen. No sender. No number. Only 7 words that sent a cold straight down his spine. You're digging too deep. Leave Rains alone. Ward stood motionless in the empty parking lot, phone glowing in the dark, and understood immediately. Someone was watching both him and Alicia, and that someone did not belong to Donovan's side. Night wrapped around Hawthorne like a thick blanket smelling of old cigarettes, stale liquor, and a silence so heavy it made time feel as if it had stopped. Mercer sat in the small bar at the end of the street, where the dim yellow lights blurred every face into the shape of a bad memory. His hand tightened around a cold beer can, and each time he closed his eyes, Alicia's image flashed clear as a camera burst. The way she pivoted, the way her hand rotated Hawkins's joint, the way her body stayed balanced, even after the violent yank. Those were not the movements of someone defending herself. They were the movements of someone who had lived her entire life inside a kill zone. Ward entered the bar, walking calmly through the loud laughter of the locals. He chose the table beside Mercer, without waiting for an invitation. "Mercer," Ward said quietly, "I want to ask about the day of the incident." Mercer took a long drink, his voice roughened by fear and exhaustion. "The FBI really cares about that?" Ward nodded, his eyes revealing nothing except the silent pressure of someone long accustomed to hearing lies. "Enough to come here in person," Ward said. Tell me, how did Rains fight? Mercer set the beer down, staring at the tabletop as if afraid to meet another person's eyes. She didn't fight, he said. She handled it. Handled it like someone who's done that all their life. Ward tilted his head slightly, absorbing each word. Mercer continued, No wasted motion, no sound. Like something I've seen in places where survival is the only law. Ward leaned forward, resting a hand on the table. Have you ever seen anything like that before? Mercer swallowed, the barlight catching the edges of his eyes, revealing an old fear still buried deep. In Iraq, he said. Once, I was with an engineering unit, supporting a small group on some strange mission. They didn't wear uniforms, didn't carry name tags. People called them off the books. Mercer leaned back, exhaling a breath that seemed to press on his ribs. They arrived fast, left faster. No one knew who they were, only that, when they showed up, someone important was about to die. Ward listened intently, not taking out his pen, yet every word seemed carved directly into his memory. You think Rains belongs to that group? He asked. Mercer shook his head faintly, though the tone of his voice betrayed a quiet confirmation. I don't dare say for sure. But… He stopped mid-sentence, as if something were tightening around his throat. I've never seen a woman fight like that. Never seen anyone move so light the ground didn't have time to sink before the other guy dropped. Ward remained silent for a moment, letting the space between them speak. Mercer rubbed his face with both hands, then continued, his voice trembling like an overstretched string. When she turned away, I saw a tattoo under the torn fabric. Small, black ink, sharp as a blade. He swallowed again, eyes dimming as an old memory surged back. I saw that mark once on the arm of one of the off-the-books operators. The one everyone said died after a mission that never made it into any record. Ward placed both hands on the table, leaning slightly closer. Would you testify to this in court? Mercer gave a short, hollow laugh, like a stone dropping into a dry well. Donovan will kill me before I get halfway to the courthouse, he said. But beneath the fear was the truth. Mercer knew too much, and people who knew too much tended to disappear quietly. Ward responded in a tone that never rose, yet cut straight through Mercer's panic. If Donovan wants someone silenced, it means that someone holds the key he fears most, and that is exactly why you have to speak. Mercer stared at Ward for a long time, as if searching the federal agent's eyes for proof of protection. Ward held his gaze, unblinking, wordlessly telling him he would not let a witness sink into the mud because of fear. In that moment, Mercer's shoulders eased slightly, as though part of the weight he'd carried since that doomed afternoon on the training field finally slid off. But almost immediately, fear returned when he remembered Donovan. He has eyes everywhere in Hawthorne, Mercer whispered. There are things you don't understand, Ward replied. I don't need to understand everything. I just need to know what he's afraid of. Mercer didn't answer, but his grip around the beer can tightened until the metal dented. He didn't know if he feared Donovan because the man was dangerous, or because Donovan represented the entire system Mercer had been bound to since the day he signed his police contract. A system where the loudest laughter came when someone weak was pushed into the dirt. Ward stood up and placed a business card on the table. This is my direct number. If you notice anyone following you or anything unusual, call immediately. Mercer stared at the card like it was a thin lifeline thrown into a black sea. Thank you, he said. But you need to move fast. They won't wait long. Ward nodded and left the bar, leaving Mercer alone under the flickering yellow light. After a moment, Mercer rose, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. The night wind carried a sharp chill down the narrow streets, making him shiver. As he walked slowly along the sidewalk, distant engines and the chirping of crickets made the Hawthorne sky feel even tighter. Mercer had barely reached the street corner when he stopped cold. At the far end of the road, a strange car sat motionless, its headlights flashing once before shutting off, as if the person inside had just recognized his face. Mercer felt his heartbeat drop into his stomach. He looked around. No one else. Yet the silence along the street grew thick and heavy, as if the night itself were forcing him into an invisible trap. He stepped back, drew a long breath, and reached for his phone. In that moment, Mercer understood he was no longer an observer standing at the edges. He had become a link in the chain, and links like him were usually cut before they ever spoke. When Rachel Sloane arrived in Hawthorne, the atmosphere inside the police department shifted, as if someone had opened a door and let cold wind sweep through. She walked through the entrance with quick, clean steps, ignoring the scrutinizing stares of the local officers. When Donovan stepped forward to greet her, Rachel did not stop. She spoke immediately. "I want every file. Not 1 minute late." Her voice made Donovan falter slightly, as if he needed to stand straighter to hide the tremor in his hands. Donovan handed her a stack of files he had prepared in advance, the pages arranged so neatly they were suspicious. Rachel opened one page, scanned it for a few seconds, then closed it with the kind of thin smile any prosecutor would wear when spotting a clumsy falsification. "You think I've never seen this level of whitewashing before?" she asked, pushing the file back toward Donovan. His complexion shifted. Though he tried to keep composed while Ward watched from behind her, studying every reaction. Rachel turned to Ward and said, "We need a seizure warrant. Every computer, every phone, every hard drive in this department." Her voice was firm and sharp as an order. Ward nodded, and the look they exchanged made clear that the investigation had entered a point of no return. In that moment, Donovan felt the ground beneath him shift slightly, as though the floor itself were sinking. Leaving the room, Donovan quickly grabbed his phone and called Price. "The FBI is digging too deep," he said, voice tight with panic. Silence lingered on the other end before Price finally responded, his tone cold enough to steal Donovan's breath. "Handle it yourself, Donovan. We don't clean up after you, and we don't protect anyone who leaves a trail." The call ended, leaving Donovan standing in the room like a man who had just received a death sentence. In the temporary interrogation room, Rachel questioned each witness. She asked quickly, clearly, giving no one the chance to deflect. When Mercer's turn came, Rachel looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Tell me everything you saw." Mercer inhaled deeply and recounted the events at the training field, though he held back the part about the tattoo. Even so, what he shared was enough to make Rachel suspect this was not a simple case of a rookie attacking an instructor. "You're telling me she didn't initiate anything, she only reacted?" Rachel asked. Mercer nodded, fingers interlaced beneath the table. "She didn't start it. But she's not ordinary." The last sentence was not an accusation but a confession of Mercer's lingering obsession. Rachel held his gaze for a few seconds, then wrote several notes. Every detail he offered pushed another indicator of doubt upright in her mind. Donovan realized the interrogations were shifting the situation in a dangerous direction. He called Henson into his office and slammed the door shut. "Find a way to pin this on her," Donovan hissed through clenched teeth. "She caused the problem, not us." Henson nodded reluctantly, though he knew from the beginning this wasn't a puzzle they could solve easily. They had assumed Alicia was prey, but now she had become the focal point of federal attention. Donovan drafted a new document intended to place full responsibility on Alicia. But just as he signed it, the office door burst open. Ward strode in with a thick folder and slammed it onto the desk hard enough to rattle the surface. "We found evidence of international transactions on your device," Ward said. His voice wasn't loud, but the pressure behind each word froze the air around Donovan. Donovan shot to his feet, trying to reclaim authority, yet fear flickered in his eyes. "You have no right to access my personal devices," he said, his voice raised to mask his panic. Ward didn't reply. He opened the folder, revealing encrypted transfers, restored emails, and communication logs with Owen Price. The evidence was too clear for denial. Rachel entered right behind Ward, her prosecutor's coat sweeping lightly as she moved. She looked at Donovan the way one looks at a wall about to collapse. "You have the right to remain silent," she said, "but I don't recommend it." Donovan swallowed, placing a hand on the edge of the desk like a man about to fall. "This is fabricated," he insisted, his confidence cracking. Rachel did not acknowledge the claim. She simply slid another digital forensics report across the table. The tension in the room rose like heat trapped under glass. Donovan stepped back half a pace, but that single step made the mask of authority fall from his face entirely. Ward pointed at the final line of the report. "You deleted 11 files containing personnel lists and travel routes. That is not the act of an innocent man." Donovan exhaled sharply, as though his own lungs were betraying him. Rachel stepped forward and placed both hands on the table across from him. "You conducted transactions with a foreign network. You transmitted classified information outside the country. You concealed, erased, and shifted blame onto others." Her voice was low, each word adding weight to his shoulders. Donovan turned his head away, like a man suddenly stripped bare. "We have every authority, Captain Donovan," Rachel said, tossing the file onto the desk he clung to. "And as of now, you are officially a target of investigation." The night wind swept along Hawthorne Avenue, carrying a skin-cutting chill that made the already closed-off town feel even more hollow. Mercer stepped out of the station just after the clock passed 10, his face drawn with the exhaustion of someone carrying a curse. He pulled his jacket closer and walked slowly toward the parking lot. Since the afternoon, he had felt as though someone were trailing him, uncertain whether it was battlefield instinct or the way Donovan had looked at him with an expression that hid no intention. Along the road connecting the residential strip to the town center, the wind rattled across a row of shuttered convenience stores, creating a clicking sound like a series of warnings. Mercer glanced into the side mirror of an old car parked across the street and again saw headlights flicker. He told himself it could be a coincidence, yet his heart pounded as if his body already knew what was coming. He picked up his pace, searching for the glow of the gas station ahead as a temporary refuge. In the shadowed gap between two streetlights, the road spread into a dim stretch where footsteps felt misplaced. From that darkness, two men stepped out, moving slow and steady, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. One of them spoke, his voice so low it sounded like an execution order. "Kyle Mercer?" Mercer stopped, the cold pavement faintly touching his shoe. He didn't reply at once. Instead, he glanced around, searching for witnesses. There were none, only the two heavy silhouettes advancing toward him. "What do you want?" Mercer asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it trembled faintly. One of the men smiled, but the smile offered no reassurance. "Unfortunately, it's not us who need you," he said. Mercer stepped back, and in that moment, he realized the object in the man's hand wasn't a gun, but it wasn't something meant for bluffing either. The faint metallic glint tightened Mercer's throat. "Listen," Mercer said, raising his hands, palms outward. "I don't want trouble." The closer man laughed, a dry sound like stones scraping. "You talk as if you get to choose." He took another step forward and raised the object so Mercer could see it clearly. In that instant, the entire town seemed to fall silent. But before he could touch Mercer, a dark figure cut across the space like a shift in the wind's direction. No footsteps, no words, only movement so fast, Mercer's eyes couldn't follow. The first man was flung toward the edge of the road, hitting the pavement shoulder first with a choked groan. The pain echoed short and sharp, like someone shutting off a valve. Mercer opened his mouth, but the sound stuck in his throat. Rains? He murmured, recognizing the person who had appeared. Alicia stood in the middle of the road, her shadow stretching under the pale yellow streetlight. She showed no urgency, no agitation. Only the quiet presence of someone who had calculated every second before acting. She glanced once at the man on the ground, then turned to Mercer. "Go," Alicia said, her voice low, cold, and leaving no room for refusal. "Go home. Don't come back out tonight." The second man roared and lunged with arms spread wide, as if he meant to grab them both. Alicia tilted to the left, light as though evading a strong gust. She placed her hand on his chest precisely, with the exact amount of force needed, sending his body snapping backward as though a taut line had yanked him. His back hit the asphalt with a thud that sounded accidental but final. Everything happened so quickly that Mercer barely caught the flick of Alicia's jacket before she stood still again. Watching it made Mercer's spine turn cold. He had seen strikes on the battlefield, had witnessed ambushes that froze a man's heart in terror. But Alicia's movements resembled none of that. Not the brutality of street fighters, but the ruthless precision of someone trained to end a situation before the opponent even understood they'd lost. Alicia stepped toward him. "Listen to me," she said, her lips moving as if reciting an internal command. "He'll try again. Donovan doesn't stop while he still has a way out." Mercer stammered. "How did you know I was here? Were you following me?" Alicia shook her head, eyes fixed on the far end of the road. "I was following Donovan." The answer made Mercer freeze, as though he had just heard the name of a predator stalking behind him. The night wind picked up, sweeping fine dust along the curb. The gas station ahead flickered with old neon light, casting a faint haze across Alicia's eyes. Mercer studied her, searching for a hint of emotion, but found only sharp concentration. He exhaled and instinctively touched the old scar on his neck. "They want to kill me?" he whispered. "No," Alicia replied. "They want to silence you." The way she stood told Mercer she didn't intend to explain further. But he also understood something crucial. She hadn't saved him out of kindness. She had saved him because his testimony could be the piece that brought Donovan crashing down. Mercer shivered at the realization that he had stepped into something far bigger than he ever expected when he applied to the department. Alicia glanced at the two unconscious men, then back toward the far end of the avenue where the darkness thickened. "Go. Tomorrow you meet with Ward and Sloan. Tell them everything." Mercer swallowed hard. "And you?" he asked. Alicia didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear, and her expression darkened. In that moment, Mercer sensed the air around them shift. The wind stopped for a heartbeat, then snapped back, as though something was approaching from the end of the street. Alicia stared into the darkness, and Mercer saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Caution. Not toward the two men on the ground, but toward someone behind them. "There's someone else involved?" Mercer asked. Alicia replied softly, "Yes, and he's more dangerous than anything you think." She didn't say the name, but Mercer felt his heartbeat spike when Donovan appeared in his mind. Not because Donovan was strong, but because behind him loomed a network no one had touched yet. Alicia stepped back, eyes scanning the end of the avenue as if measuring distance for another confrontation. "Go, Mercer. Tonight isn't safe for anyone standing on the sidelines." Mercer nodded, retreating before turning to run toward the gas station, his mind full of questions, his feet driven by raw survival instinct. Alicia remained alone under the dull yellow light, the wind tugging at her jacket like a torn flag in a storm. She looked at the two men on the ground for a few seconds, then back toward the end of the road, where the heavy darkness seemed to move. The morning of the hearing opened with Richmond wrapped in a thin veil of mist, like a curtain drawn over half the truth of the day. In front of the doors of the federal courthouse, long lines of townspeople waited, collars pulled high against the winter wind, but their eyes alert with curiosity. They whispered the story Hawthorne had traded back and forth for weeks. "Captain Donovan? No way," one man said, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Another answered, "Impossible or not, it happened. That man's house hides plenty." Those murmurs blended, forming an atmosphere heavy with years of compressed suspicion. Donovan stepped through security, his suit pressed, and a deep blue tie knotted neatly. From afar, he seemed calm, like a man who once ran an entire police department. But when he extended his hand for the security check, his fingers trembled slightly, betraying the truth beneath. He hated being looked at like a criminal. His face was stone, yet his eyes twitched constantly, scanning the crowd for something to cling to. The only thing he did not find was the respect he was used to. Rachel Sloane stood at the prosecution table, one hand resting on a stack of files thick enough to cast its own shadow on the wood. She gave a small nod toward Ward, who was taking notes in the front row. "Today we unlock the first layer," she said, her voice calm yet sharp enough that Donovan, from across the room, heard it and felt as though someone had just turned a key inside the lock of his own life. Ward returned the nod, small but certain. Judge Elliot Hartman entered, holding an old wooden gavel whose strike still sounded like a miniature explosion. "The court now opens proceedings in United States versus Gregory Donovan," he declared. The room fell into silence, broken only by the rustling of paper and the heavy breathing of a few people seated in the back row. Heads bowed, but eyes followed Donovan's every movement. He swallowed hard when he heard his own name read out like a sentence. Donovan's defense attorney rose first, his voice forceful as if volume alone could blur the edges of truth. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a political witch hunt targeting a man who has served his community for 30 years. A few heads nodded, but many others scoffed quietly. They knew how much darkness those 30 years contained. Donovan shot a glance toward the door, as if he might run, but his legs refused to move. Rachel rose, lifting the heavy file with one hand, her wrist dipping slightly under the weight. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and cold, "today we will show that there are no witches here. Only the truth that Mr. Donovan tried to bury. And we will dig up every layer." Donovan kept his expression stiff, but a twitch rippled through his eyelid at her words. Ward sat beside her, watching both sides, the prosecution and the defense. But what drew his attention most was the visitors' seating. At the far back, there was an empty chair. No one sat in it, no name marked it, but to someone as observant as Ward, that empty seat looked like it belonged to an unseen witness. He glanced around the room, hoping to see Alicia, but nothing suggested she had ever stepped inside. Donovan shifted his gaze toward Mercer, who waited outside the courtroom. His stare landed heavy, like a stone across someone's shoulders. Through clenched teeth, he whispered, "You ruined me, Kyle." Mercer did not hear him, but a cold jolt slid down his spine, keeping him from standing still. He clenched his hands, fighting the tremor, rising at the memory of the night before. If Alicia had not appeared, he would already be a non-standard death in a report. The judge struck the gavel again, ending the opening statements. The defense attempted to present grounds for clearing Donovan, but Rachel cut in, her tone sharp as a blade. "Let the court hear the evidence before it hears excuses." The press row stirred, pens poised, cameras glowing. A verdict had yet to be spoken, but its heat was already filling the hallways. Ward rose to present the first set of documents. He placed a small USB drive on the table with the cold precision of placing national-level evidence. "This is the network log from the Hawthorne Police Department," he said, enunciating each word. "It contains traces of abnormal data deletion directly tied to the defendant's account." Donovan's eyes widened. He knew what Ward had found, but he did not understand how they had found it so quickly. A lifetime of hiding is undone in a few weeks. Rachel presented the second file. We will also demonstrate a financial connection between Mr. Donovan and Owen Price, representative of a foreign private security firm. These undisclosed transactions span years and exceed public sector income many times over. Donovan squeezed his fists until his fingers darkened. Anyone could see he was swallowing rage, and Greg Donovan had never been a man who endured quietly. From the defense table, Donovan leaned close to his lawyer, whispering, "Shut them down, any way you can." The lawyer gave him a measured look. "We're only at the start. Do not lose control here." But the warning fell flat. Donovan watched his life cracking apart in real time. The judge called for the first witness. A police officer rose, trembling as he approached the stand. But Ward did not watch him. His attention returned to the empty chair in the back. "Where is she?" he thought. Rachel had never asked Alicia to testify. The Justice Department had never required her statement. Yet the entire case began with her, revolved around her, and existed because of that incident at the training field. Alicia was a thread woven through everything, invisible but unbreakable. Ward frowned. Why is Alicia Rains not listed as a witness? The question formed sharply in his mind. The witness list lacked nothing except the most important witness of all. That omission rattled him more than any testimony that morning. As Mercer prepared to enter the courtroom, Ward rose and gently stopped him. "Are you certain?" Ward asked. Mercer drew a deep breath, then nodded. "She said there's no going back," he whispered. "If I stay silent, no one survives Hawthorne." Ward met his eyes and saw fear, but also the resolve of a man who had been outrunning his conscience for too long. "Go," Ward said. "Today, the wheels start turning." 2-1. From the prosecution table, Rachel watched the two men, her gaze sliding past them to the empty chair. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, as if she understood the unspoken question echoing across the room. Some ghosts never need to appear in a courtroom. The weight of their presence is enough to make the entire court bow. The courtroom that afternoon was as silent as a church, yet the air felt thick, as though someone had shut the doors and trapped the entire truth inside four walls. When Judge Hartman called Mercer's name, the audience leaned forward slightly, wanting a clearer look at the man who had once been just a small-town officer, but was now the most crucial link in the entire case. Mercer walked to the witness stand with a slow, deliberate gait. He did not hide his nervousness, but in his eyes was something that, once decided, could not be shaken. When he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, he closed his eyes for a single second, as if pushing away the echo of the night he almost died on Hawthorne Avenue. When he opened them again, he was ready. Rachel stepped closer to the stand. "Mr. Mercer, tell the court what happened at the training field." Mercer drew a long breath. "Hawkins attacked Miss Rains first. She reacted by neutralizing him. But what stayed with me wasn't the strike. It was the way she stood afterward." He paused, his voice lowering. "That is the stance of someone trained, deeply trained to survive." Donovan's attorney sprang to his feet almost instantly. "So you're saying a police recruit is special forces? What medication did you take this morning, Mr. Mercer?" The courtroom stirred, a few suppressed laughs rising. Mercer did not look at the lawyer. He stared directly at the bench, his voice steady and heavy. "I served in Iraq. I worked alongside people the military called off-the-list operators. They wore no uniforms. They never appeared in reports. But I recognize how they move. And Miss Rains moved exactly like them." The courtroom froze. Even the journalists stopped writing. Donovan shifted restlessly in his seat, his face darkening as if watching a blade slip from his own hand. From the prosecution table, Ward nodded lightly, confirming that Mercer's words were not wild speculation. Rachel signaled for Mercer to continue. "Did you see any unusual tattoo on her?" she asked. Mercer swallowed. I'm not entirely certain, but I saw faint ink on her left shoulder. It resembled one of the symbols I once saw on the arm of a cooperating operative, a man who later vanished from the system. Donovan's attorney jumped up again. Objection. Pure speculation, and based on the witness's unreliable memory. Rachel turned to him, her eyes sharp like a metal click before a pen snaps. I'm not asking the court to accept speculation. I'm asking the court to hear what Mr. Donovan has always tried to hide. Judge Hartman nodded. Objection overruled. Mercer exhaled, as though releasing a portion of the burden. He glanced at his own hands, still trembling faintly at the memory of Alicia standing in front of him on that night. She saved my life, he said softly, but the words carried through the courtroom. Without her, I would be dead. The air grew so heavy that people felt they could see their own breath. Some Hawthorne residents bowed their heads, guilt threading into their chests as they remembered how they once turned their backs on the quiet recruit. Rachel offered a faint smile, then shifted into the next phase of the hearing. Your Honor, the prosecution calls the FBI Digital Forensics Team, even dollars bedded. 2 technicians stepped forward, carrying laptops, and extracted data. The first spoke clearly. We recovered 34 deleted files from the defendant's computer. All were scrubbed using a federal-level method. A small-town officer would not know how to do this. The courtroom collectively recoiled. Donovan bit his lip until it broke, while his attorney tried to take notes with visibly shaking hands. The second technician opened a slide of transaction logs. This is the list of accounts linked to Owen Price's private security firm. Over the past 2 years, the defendant received 7 encrypted payments, totaling 8 times his lawful income. A soft gasp rose from the press row. Rachel stepped forward again, resuming control. Your Honor, the prosecution calls international security expert Martin Keene. Keene walked up with the calm of someone accustomed to exposing what others bury. He scanned the room and began, voice deep and steady. I reviewed the scrub protocol found on Mr. Donovan's device. This is the type we encounter within federal agencies or foreign intelligence services. A small-town officer could not know or execute this. Someone trained him, or he worked with someone capable of doing so. Donovan swallowed hard at the word intelligence. It felt as if someone had thrown all of Hawthorne's sand into his face, exposing every flaw he tried to bury. Rachel approached and placed a new file on the evidence stand. Your Honor, the final exhibit for today. The courtroom went still, except for the creak of chairs and Donovan's frantic heartbeat. Rachel pressed play. 2 voices played, one cold, one gravelly. The first? I need more documents. Next month's meeting cannot be empty. The second? Send it through the old route. Leave no trace. Only 7 seconds long, but enough for every juror to lift their head. Donovan's lawyer lunged forward like a man trying to catch something falling from his own hands. Your Honor, this does not verify that my client conducted the transaction. It could be doctored or taken out of con. Rachel cut him off. Your Honor, shall the prosecution only be allowed to present evidence if we catch Mr. Donovan on camera handing over a suitcase of cash? A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the courtroom until the judge struck the gavel for order. Donovan was sweating now, partly because the evidence hit him like a series of blows, partly because he knew one piece remained motive. And if Rachel dug back to its origin, he would have no path out. Mercer stepped down from the witness stand. He had taken only 2 steps when Donovan shot to his feet. Rage bulldozed over his self-control. You turned on me for that filthy little black girl? The courtroom exploded. People shouted. Others leapt from their seats, and Ward immediately pulled Donovan back. Judge Hartman slammed the gavel so hard it bounced. Silence! One more remark like that, and it will be admitted as evidence of witness intimidation. Rachel did not look at Donovan. She watched the moment his eyes shifted wild, first, then icy, as he realized he had exposed himself. But what caught her attention most was something smaller. He called Alicia the girl, as if he knew more than he had ever admitted. A question flashed in Rachel's mind, sharp as a crack splitting a wall. The thought widened like a fracture in concrete, and she understood immediately that if she followed that fracture, Donovan's entire empire would collapse even faster than she had anticipated. On sentencing morning, the hallways of the Richmond Federal Courthouse were so crowded that security staff had to set up additional barriers. Hawthorne residents stood shoulder to shoulder, carrying with them a mixture of anticipation and unease. They had not come to mourn Donovan, nor to cheer at his downfall. They came because for the first time in decades, the question they had always avoided was finally being placed on the table. Did justice truly exist in their town? Inside the courtroom, Donovan was brought in wearing a dark suit, but the crisp fabric could not hide the ash-like pallor on his face. His eyes darted around, searching for something to cling to, but met only averted gazes. Colleagues who once raised glasses with him now slid into seats at the back, unwilling to be seen as allied with a corrupt man. Donovan tried to sit upright, tried to maintain the posture of a seasoned officer, but the hand he hid beneath the table clenched repeatedly. Rachel had arrived early. She stood beside the prosecution table, adjusting a few sheets on the desk. There was no triumph on her face, no anger, only the cold focus of someone who had reached the end of a very long road. When Donovan lifted his head toward her, her eyes did not linger even half a second, as if he were merely a completed file she had already stamped and set aside. Ward entered and sat behind the prosecution row. He studied the room, noting every expression on the jurors' faces. Some looked firm, a few seemed tired, but all carried an altered gaze after the previous day's testimonies. He sensed it clearly. The verdict would not be lenient. When Judge Hartman entered, the sound of the gavel hitting the bench silenced the room like the moment before a storm breaks. Today, the Federal Court of Richmond delivers the sentencing of the defendant, Gregory Donovan, he said. His voice was steady, direct, cutting through the air like a steel wire. The jury filed into their designated seats. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver hair, held the written verdict in her hand. 3 hours of deliberation for a federal corruption case was unusually fast, and that speed chilled Donovan's spine. He bowed his head slightly, though his eyes never left that sheet of paper. We find the defendant, Gregory Donovan, guilty of. The charges were read one by one, each line stripping away another layer of the man he had pretended to be. Trafficking classified materials, accepting bribes from a foreign organization, obstructing a federal investigation, abusing power, conspiracy to harm a witness. Each guilty carried with it the memory of the years the town had looked away from its own decay. Donovan leaned heavily against the back of his chair as the final charge was spoken. He muttered something, but no one heard clearly. Perhaps a curse, perhaps a desperate justification. Whatever it was, it no longer held weight. Rachel stared straight toward the jury. She did not smile, did not nod. She simply stood still like a gatekeeper, allowing justice to walk through on its own. Judge Hartman adjusted his glasses and opened the sentencing document. No one in the courtroom moved. He read each line, each pause, as though every word had been weighed to the edge of severity. For the combined offenses, the defendant Gregory Donovan is sentenced to 20 years for trafficking classified materials, 12 years for accepting bribes from a foreign organization, 10 years for obstructing a federal investigation, and 10 years for conspiracy to harm a witness. He paused, letting the weight settle. In total, 52 years in federal prison. It's not bad. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath for a single instant. Then came the scraping of chairs, soft murmurs rising like a low tide. Some people glanced at one another, unable to believe what they had heard. Others nodded slowly, as though watching an old chapter finally being sealed shut. Donovan could not stand. He sank into his seat as if someone had shot out his knees. 52! He echoed, his voice distorted. For a girl? For some stupid little clip? He gave a broken laugh, the sound disintegrating into a hoarse exhale. But behind the anger and humiliation in his eyes was absolute panic. Rachel gathered the files into her case. She did not look at Donovan, not granting him even a single second more. As she passed Ward, she spoke softly enough for him alone. Justice is not fast, but today it ran in the right direction. Ward nodded, though his eyes remained heavy, as if something still eluded his understanding. Mercer sat behind them, his hands trembling slightly as he held his cap to his chest. He felt neither joy nor relief. Instead, the night on Hawthorne Avenue replayed in his mind. Alicia, stepping out of nowhere, her voice simple yet life-saving. He wondered, amid the final gavels and legal declarations, where she was now. Federal officers approached to handcuff Donovan. He did not resist. As they escorted him through the narrow hallway, each footstep echoed heavy and hollow. People who once stood in the corridors to slap his back now moved aside, wary of brushing against the residue of what he had become. At the end of the hallway, just before turning toward the holding cells, Donovan suddenly stopped. He twisted his head to look directly at Ward, following behind. His gaze was no longer that of a fallen officer, but that of a desperate man clinging to the last thing he could throw back. "You think this is over?" His voice was not loud, but it reverberated against the glass walls. "They will go after her first." Ward froze in the middle of the corridor. A chill spread down his spine. Who were they? Why was Donovan so certain? And why, out of everything he could have said, was the only thing he hurled back a warning about Alicia? The afternoon after the sentencing, Hawthorne Field lay in a silence the town was not accustomed to. The wooden posts, the faded containers, and the tires sat motionless under the pale gold sun, drained of all their former life. There were no mocking laughs anymore, no coarse shouting, no boots pounding into sand. Hawthorne Field looked like an empty shell, stripped of its manufactured noise. Alicia stood in the center of the training yard, her feet sinking lightly into the hot sand that still held the heat of midday. She looked around at the place that had once been the hunting ground of Hawkins, Tomley, and those who believed strength was the same as the right to oppress. The sand still carried old footprints, the prints from the day she was dragged down, and the prints from the moment she rose and changed a town. A breeze swept through, carrying a thin trail of dust, as if it wanted to erase every trace of that gray morning that had once unfolded here. Alicia bent down to pick up a hair tie she had dropped during her last training session. She rolled it lightly in her hand, then let it fall back into the sand. "Anything that carries my trace stays behind," she murmured. Ghosts were trained never to leave emotional maps. When the mission ended, they detached from everything, as if they had never belonged. She left the training yard and crossed the small road leading toward the motel. The two-story rooms were lined in a straight row, their facades painted in a fading silver blue. She opened the door of her rented room and turned on the light, the yellow glow falling over a space. A single bed, a small table, a suitcase already packed. No pictures, no scattered papers, no details suggesting anyone had ever lived here. Alicia finished packing within minutes. The last piece of clothing was folded and placed into the suitcase according to the rule drilled into her for years. Neat, flat, leaving no trace. Each item vanished from the room like pieces of memory being erased, and the room returned to complete emptiness, as if the past 2 months had been nothing but smoke. As Alicia carried her suitcase down the wooden stairs, the motel manager was watering plants near the walkway. He looked up when he saw her passing. "You're leaving? I never saw you talk to anyone," he said, his tone not curious, merely offering a polite farewell to a guest who had never caused trouble. Alicia paused. "Thank you for keeping the room key for me," she replied, her voice soft, yet firm. The manager nodded and returned to watering, as if careful not to interfere with the quiet aura he sensed around her. Out on the highway, Alicia walked toward the bus stop. The late afternoon sky was washed in light orange, the sunlight falling over the dry trees like the final stroke on a painting ready to be stored away. A breeze drifted past, carrying Hawthorne's familiar dusty scent, a scent she knew she would never recall again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Mercer's name appeared on the screen. She looked at it for a few seconds, then placed the phone back. She knew what he wanted to say, but no tie between them required being kept. Mercer needed to finish his part of the journey without her shadow beside him. As for her, the mission had ended the moment Donovan was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. A few minutes later, another message arrived from Ward. "You don't need to say anything, but thank you for saving a life." Alicia read it, then turned off the screen. The message was marked as "Seen," and that was all she left behind. Ward would understand. People like her were not allowed to stay long in anyone's life. When the federal bus pulled up to the station, Alicia stepped on without looking back at the town. The doors closed, and with the first movement of the bus, the street lamp outside slid away, as though slowly disappearing from her memory. Sunlight swept through the bus windows, casting a thin sheet of brightness over her face, before stretching her shadow behind her. Hawthorne County receded, shrinking, blurring, until it became a brown smear on the horizon. To those who remained, it was a fractured town, freshly relieved of one rotting piece. To Alicia, it was simply a point on a map, a coordinate she had been assigned, and then withdrawn from like hundreds of missions before it. She sat in the back row, where she could observe the entire bus. Most passengers were dozing or staring at their phones. No one noticed her, and that was what she was most accustomed to, moving through crowds without anyone acknowledging her existence. That had always been how ghosts traveled. As the bus merged onto the highway, Alicia pulled out her phone again, this time not to read Mercer's message or respond to Ward. A notification appeared on the screen, with no sender name, no address. Only one line. "You have one unread email." Alicia tapped it. The screen opened to the encrypted inbox, accessible only to the CIA and 2 associated organizations. At the top of the list sat a new email. The sender was masked, coded in a format belonging to no CIA, NSA, or federal agency she had ever worked with. She opened it. The subject line held only 4 words. "It's time, Agent Rains. 18s." Alicia leaned back in her seat. Her eyes did not flicker, but something inside her rippled faintly, like a lake surface swept by sudden wind. Whoever sent this knew her encryption key. That meant they had access to a tier of information that even some CIA directors could not reach. It meant they had been watching her during the entire mission, without intervening. The email had no other text. No location, no instructions, no greeting. Just 4 words, sharp as a blade. "It's time, Agent Rains." She turned off the screen, but the phrase continued threading itself through her mind like a strand pulled from darkness. Donovan had spoken of them. Ward had hesitated at that word, and now, this brief email as thin as a razor, was the answer no one wanted to touch. Inside the dim cabin of the bus, the email opened into the darkness, its cold blue glow sliding across Alicia's face and tinting her calm expression with an unfamiliar chill. She read the first line, each word appearing with the clarity of a command issued from a past that had never truly released her. "You stayed invisible. You stayed human." At that exact moment, A sharp pressure bloomed from her temple down the bridge of her noselight, but precise enough to trigger the layer of memory once locked inside her mind. Fragments of images spun like shards of glass, catching streetlight. An audio clip activated on its own. No attachment shown, no sender identified. A man's voice, low, rough, carrying the slight metallic echo of battlefield recording equipment. Rains, if you survived, they will come for you. Not CIA, not FBI, but us. The tone struck a set of tightly wound chords inside Alicia's mind, vibrating like an impossible echo from a place her rational mind believed she had never been. The phone screen dimmed for a beat, then flickered with a fleeting image. A dark, dust-choked desert, a gray-brown sky, and the silhouette of a soldier turned slightly sideways, a faint white circle slashed by a pale diagonal line on his left shoulder. Alicia stared at the image for several seconds, unease rising with the strange familiarity it carried, like standing before a locked room whose code she once knew. "I have seen them somewhere," she murmured, as her pulse climbed, as though memory itself were outrunning thought. The email included one attachment, a single image. When she opened it, she found the emblem of Project Rise. The same white circle crossed by a muted diagonal. No caption, no metadata. The starkness of it made her feel as if she were standing before an organization operating outside everything she had ever known. A thin whisper in her mind recited, "We do what governments can't, and what they fear." Her hand pressed against the armrest as a tremor ran through her fingertips. She sat upright, drawing a slow breath. In that moment, she realized she no longer sat in the mindset of a ghost trained for CIA missions. What rose in her instead felt like the sudden snap of a door forced shut too long, now blown open by the surge of suppressed memory. "Project Rise," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like the return of a language she once spoke fluently, as if it belonged to a unit. Her body remembered, even when her mind could not. The phone buzzed again. A new line appeared under the emblem. Hawthorne was only the warm-up. Alicia felt herself steady, bracing for something heavier than everything that had already unfolded. Then came the next line. Hawthorne Bridge. Midnight. And finally, a last whisper of text, fading gray. "Someone will be waiting. Don't be afraid of the dark. You were born in it." She sat still. Outside the bus window, the world darkened, street lamps stretching into long amber smears like memories pulled thin. Her reflection hovered faintly against the glass, features calm, but eyes stripped of their usual stillness. In their place lived a deeper vigilance, the kind possessed by someone who realizes the real battle has only just begun. She closed her eyes, and the memories once erased surged forward in blurry film. She was running down a crumbling hallway, distant gunfire echoing. A man stood with his back to her, outlined by a white, hazy light, the Rise emblem on his shoulder. He signaled urgently, "Rains, get out! If they take you, they'll use you to unlock the structure." His face blurred, but his voice aligned perfectly with the audio that had just arrived in her inbox. The sharp pain behind her eyes returned harder this time. Alicia opened them again. The man from her memory had never been assigned a name, but she remembered the way he looked at her just before the ground collapsed beneath the desert outpost where they'd taken cover. She had always assumed that moment was a hallucination, a trick of trauma, when she woke in a field hospital with holes in her recollection. Now she understood. CIA hadn't erased a mission. They'd erased an entire life they were afraid she might return to. The bus turned across an overpass. Headlights skimmed over the pavement, casting cold streaks of light across Alicia's face. She opened her palm, her fingers curved inward, an instinctive combat posture she didn't consciously remember learning. It was as if her body recalled a tool, a device, a weapon not found in any CIA arsenal. The familiarity of the sensation brushed her breath into something sharp, like a blade unsheathed. She lifted the phone again and scrolled to the bottom of the email. In the lower right corner sat a small, unfamiliar icon: memory unlock protocol. When she tapped it, the screen shifted to a verification prompt. "Do you consent to retrieve?" Alicia stared for several seconds, then pressed yes. Innis Tudum. A short audio file played. White light burst across the screen. The same man's voice returned, unmistakable now. "If you hear this, Rains, it means the scrub did not hold. Find us before they do." Alicia let the phone fall against her thigh, her gaze fixed forward as if the night outside were stretching open to reveal the path ahead. Hawthorne Bridge appeared in the distance, its lights trembling across the river in thin golden shards. The bus slowed, tires whispering across concrete. She rose before the vehicle fully stopped, her hand closing around the handle of her suitcase. The doors hissed open. Night wind slapped gently against her face. Alicia stepped onto the bridge, cool pavement humming beneath her boots. The bus pulled away and dissolved into the darkness, leaving her alone with the rhythm of water hitting the support pillars below. The faint rust and mist smell brushed the back of her tongue. The bridge lights glowed weakly, swallowed partially by fog. She scanned the length of the bridge, silent, waiting. A figure stood several dozen meters away, leaning casually against the railing. Wind lifted the hem of his coat. Light from the nearest lamp fell across the emblem on his left shoulder, the white, slashed circle. He did not rush toward her. Instead, he angled his head just enough for their eyes to meet. A bolt of recognition shot down her spine. Not fear, but the shock of rediscovered memory pushing through its restraints. He spoke first, voice matching the email perfectly. "Agent Rains." She stepped forward. "I remember." His reply came slow, deliberate. "Project Rise never abandons anyone. We only sleep in the dark until called awake." Wind swept across the bridge, vibrating the steel cables like warnings rising from deep underground. Alicia faced him fully. Her gaze sharpened with a calm alertness, like someone who had spent her whole life preparing to wake exactly this way. "Why did they erase my memory?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you saw something the government feared, and because you're one of the few capable of bringing it back into the light." Silence stretched between them. The river fractured the bridge lights into broken gold beneath their feet. The man stepped closer and held out a thin metal ID card. "We have a war to resume," he said. "Hawthorne was only a signal test. Project Rise is active again. Eindhoven Ben." Alicia took the card, her fingertips tracing the smooth etched ring. She lifted her face, and the light in her eyes no longer hid behind any memory barrier. "Rise," she murmured, voice low, pulled from the depths of the past. "I remember you." The wind surged, sweeping a fine layer of dust across the bridge. The man turned toward the shadowed end of the span. Alicia fell into step behind him, silent, precise, each footfall carrying her farther from Hawthorne and deeper into a world the town would never comprehend.